Hey everyone, Praveen here. We are very excited to be joined by Vikram Bhaskaran today. Vikram is one of the very few people in India who has worked at two of the largest SaaS companies from India, both Freshworks and Chargebee. And today he serves as a VP of Growth Marketing at thoughtspot, another unicorn in the analytics and business intelligence space. In addition to this, Vikram also advises a lot of early stage startups in terms of how to set up their marketing teams and set up the go-to-market function, right? So he has a very unique perspective into the the evolution of SaaS in India. Vikram, excited to have you here. Thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Praveen. Super excited to join this call.
Yeah, cool. So Vikram and we've known each other for over 3 years now. We met when Vikram was at Chargebee first, and we've been in touch on and off. He's been very helpful with his advice and inputs for us as we build out factors as a product as well. And for a while now, we've been wanting to kind of do this session, so I'm really excited. Vikram, what I thought we could start with was just your journey at Chargebee, right? Because you've seen that company grow from, if I'm not mistaken, roughly three to $3.5 million in revenue to $80 million, right? So that's like a 20-25x growth that you've seen. So can you talk about when you joined Chargebee, what was the marketing team there like? What was the go-to-market motion? How was it all set up at that time?
Sure. So you're right. I joined Chargebee at around a little over 3.5 mil in revenue. And obviously, we already had a marketing team at that point. I inherited a small but amazing marketing team. I think 5 people, 5-member marketing team, and it was like really smart folks. We knew from day zero that we were going to be very inbound focused. So we had a very strong inbound muscle. We had a very strong content repository already in place. But one of the interesting things, like when I go back and I try to piece, the stage by stage evolution at Chargebee, one of the first things I remember when I joined the team, and we were clocking roughly say 300 leads per month. And one of my questions to the team was, if we had, let's say, unlimited budgets, how far do you think we can crack? And they put their heads together, thought about it, and came back with maybe we can do 350, maybe 400. Right? In about 5.5 months, we were clocking a little over 3,200, right? Over 10x of that. So this wasn't a question of ability. It was a question of belief and some systems and process, some very foundational frameworks in hindsight that we're able to implement and actually get that machine rolling, right? To actually execute on that scale. So yeah, that's actually a very interesting part of one of the first phases of my journey. And there are like so many little nuances about the evolution. For example, right, when I brought in one aspect is this. One aspect is, let's say, pipeline delivery. So when I came in at 3.5 mil, 100% of our pipeline was only driven through inbound, right?
So already at that stage, it was fully inbound, even when you
it was 100% inbound. It was like we had no outbound strategy whatsoever. In fact, it took us an embarrassingly long time. It took us a little over, I'm going to say 50 plus mil when we started getting better at building an outbound playbook. And it was almost at 70 mil when outbound started delivering in a predictable enough manner. Right?
So one follow-on question there, Vikram. So, and the reason I ask is, when I speak to a bunch of our customers today at Factors, I see that many of them are embracing outbound, at an earlier stage, right? So do you see that was a function of the time when Chargebee was growing to say inbound work better, or was it a function of the industry? Do you also observe that companies are starting out outbound sooner now when you're advising these startups?
Okay, so a little caveat here, right? Like, you know the saying, when you have a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail, right? I'm an inbound person. So my career journey, you mentioned 2 unicorns. Actually, so I started my career with Zoho, right?
Oh, okay.
So that's a third one. And then I was very briefly the head of marketing at Fusion Charts, which was at that point the second coolest product company out of India, right? And then Freshworks, and then Chargebee, and now ThoughtSpot. So I've through a majority of this journey, you'll notice that there is a very like all of these organizations are high volume, SME focused, global play kind of organizations. And for these organizations, inbound makes the most sense. So for us, when we started Chargebee, there was still, in fact, in the early days when the founders first started the company, before I joined, there was this question of, okay, so is this a category? Are there going to be enough subscription based businesses coming out to actually make this space make sense, right? And there were two ways that the founders could have gone about with it, right? One was they could have said, hey, you know what, there are only 5 subscription based companies in the world today, and let's build a product for them. Let's go outbound, let's go wine and dine with these guys, sell it to them, and then we'll grow on top of them. Or the second, which I think in hindsight was a supremely intelligent move, is to look at, okay, this is where I see the market moving. Right? When we started, for a good time, when we started building the product, the market was still kind of catching up. Right? Even when I joined Chargebee, we knew that there were more and more subscription business and SaaS-based business coming out. Like by 2018, if you were starting a technology product company and it was not SaaS, it was absurd, right? Like, what are you even doing? By 2020, around the time of the pandemic, was like we had basically built an amazing machine exactly for that kind of a scenario in the tech world. Right? It was a beautiful machine that was already built. We had all of our plumbing and piping ready to capitalize on the surge that we saw across tech, across e-com, across OTT e-learning, and that was a phenomenal growth story for us.
Got it. Understood. So you're saying at that point you were slightly ahead of the market in terms of the product, and as and when the market kind of evolved to have a lot more subscription businesses, the core business strategy was to say, let's focus on inbound. There is enough of a market, then they'll come inbound. And when you joined, what were these 5 people in the marketing team doing?
Just 1 second for us to like go back. I want to zero down on this a little bit more, right? So there are 3 things that I advise a lot of founders and GTM leaders to look at when, this question of inbound versus outbound. And today there is an inbound, outbound. There's also blended, right? Like most businesses, it makes sense for you to have a mixed strategy where you're making inbound investments, you are making outbound investments, you are also driving a blended ABM-ish gameplay. But where is your head at? How are you looking at the shape of your market? And there are 3 things that I look at, right? One is I look at the shape of demand, right? Is there a wide existing demand for your product category? Right? So if, for example, let's take Freshworks, most Freshworks products, right? Let's take Freshdesk, which is their flagship help desk product. Now, this is an established category of product. There are, if there are 1,000 companies every day, there are 1,000 people looking for a better way to manage their customer conversations, right? So there is a wide extent market demand for this category of product, right? The second is the need itself. Is it an obvious need or is it an evangelical need, right? So if it is, and so there are categories. For example, right, when we started Chargebee, there was a certain degree of evangelism that we needed to do, right? We needed to explain SaaS. We needed to explain what this thing is, right? What is a subscription management software? This was even true back in the day in Zoho, right? When Zoho first started out their SaaS offerings, and we had to go out and explain the concept of SaaS. We had to explain that, hey, you know what, your data on the cloud is actually a smart, wise decision for you, right? Salesforce had to do that, right? So a lot of like if your need is obvious, but still your category has to be evangelized. That again defines how much of a sway you have on whether you want to go inbound or outbound. If you are going into an existing category where today, if somebody were entering the CRM space, I don't know why they would, but if they did, or let's say you were building an alternative to Gong, where it's clearly established amongst B2B buyers what Gong is and what this category is, what is this product supposed to be doing. That is the second beautiful factor in helping you decide if you want to go very inbound heavy, and with an inbound, do you want to predominantly go on a bottom of the funnel SEM strategy, or do you want to go with more content, education, nurturing kind of stuff? Then there's a third part in defining the shape of the product, which kind of has started applying to B2B also, in that your product, like, does it have an inherent sense of virality? Now, if your product has, for example, Notion, has an inherent, like it's inherently designed for a certain degree of virality, for a certain degree of spread, right? Slack is designed for a certain degree of spread within an organization, right? Once it captures. Most analytic solutions, for example, are designed for an inherent spread, right? So if you have these capabilities, then cracking large volume play by with a very strong inbound focus makes a lot of sense, right? Your first move to make it in terms of inbound makes a lot of sense. And then this point, sorry, I'm just adding on. So this goes back all the way to when we were at Zoho, right? And so at Zoho, like back then, this is like 2006, 7, 8 maybe, and this idea of inbound was still not as obvious as it is today, right? Like this inbound outbound. Back then, sales was done in a very specific way, right? You had all your valley startups. If you are a company that's selling to the US, and your competitors are sitting in the valley, and they have an inherent advantage in that they can go down, they can wine dine with their clients, they can do all of that stuff, and therefore you have an inherent disadvantage, right? You can't do that unless you're willing to invest that crazy amount with feet on street sales. But in that model, the thing that gets underserved is the huge mid-market and SMB segment, right? So, if, like at Zoho, we started calling it, instead of calling it the India disadvantage, we started calling this the India advantage. And that this market was super underserved, and because we had to learn the inbound muscle, we became really good at it. Right? We became incredibly better than most of our competitors, right? And that became, in fact, from a differentiator from a GTM perspective, and the kind of products we built, the kind of customers we went after, right? So.
Got it. Now, so building on that thought, right now, do you see any change in that approach to say, hey, the India advantage, mid-market, SMB, SaaS, versus, let's say, new startups that you are advising? Do you see like a preference to say, hey, no, let's go enterprise right from day zero? Because the store, at least the way it panned out, both at Chargebee and Freshworks, is eventually they did want to kind of go into the enterprise segment, right? Today, do you see startups doing that far earlier in their cycle?
Yes and no. I see some startups which are designed for enterprise, which try to build for enterprise, and there's logical sense to it, right? If you understood and you're able to build for a customer, and then you try to replicate it. I also see startups building for easy products with ease of use, with speed, and actually time to go live being a core value prop. And that an inbound, like, and for them, the inbound model makes a lot of sense. Again, there is also an inherent bias here, right? I keep saying this because probably there are more startups which are focused on outbound and which do a brilliant job at outbound or enterprise selling, but they do not typically fall into my radar, or my passion takes me closer to businesses which are focused on mid-market, which are trying to crack volumes.
Got it. Understood. So coming back to Chargebee, right? So when you joined, like, what was the team structure like? What were they doing, the 5 people? Was it all like Google search, or it was a split of like search and then content?
So I'll try to remember this best I can. There were a couple of people in content, focused predominantly in content. There was, I think, one person focused on paid search on SEM, one person focused on SEO, and one person that was basically a catch-all, right? Who was doing everything else, who was doing a little bit of product marketing, like here and there, like a whole bunch of different things. And this is kind of how the team was. And one of the first things I did was kind of structuring the team. Now we only had 5 people, right? So there's only and we had 4 problems to solve. You can't structure the team that way. So we created this idea. I call them blocks or pods, right? And I call them blocks because in my presentation, each was a block, each was a rectangle, right? And each block had a goal, a metric, and a contract, right? A goal, a metric, and a contract, right? So I broke it into a demand block, right? Whose job was to drive. Initially, it was to drive leads, qualified leads, and then eventually it moved on, it evolved to drive pipeline. And so the metric there was pipeline dollars, qualified pipeline, and the contract was experimentation, right? So I believe most startups, they are in a startup because you want to grow, right? And the moment growth stops is when you stop being a very good startup, right? And growth comes from experimentation, which means there needs to be a constant effort and framework for experimentation. Right? So that was the first contract. Then we had, I think, the product marketing block, which was focused on adoption, right? On driving on getting users to sign up for the product and get them to actually adopt key capabilities of the product, right? And since this block was owning the users coming in through sign up, working very closely with sales in terms of what was converting, how do we better make these guys get through the rest of our funnel, they had a contract to drive back on quality to demand, right? So basically, product marketing was the governor of quality for demand, right? And we had our brand/content function. So the focus of content can get very tricky. So it can get tricky in that, you say content doesn't have to drive demand, and then you turn around and you're like, okay, we're doing so many content, how is this relevant, is it driving demand? So we decided that the contract for content was to drive engagement, right? I'm not going to ask this team to get me leads or pipeline. I'm going to ask them to give me engagement. I want you readers to come in, read our content, and then keep coming back for more and more content, right? And whether it's through subscriptions, newsletters, subscriptions, all like returning users, all of that stuff. And the contract there was what percentage of this belongs to our ICP. As long as you have our ideal customer profile coming back and consuming content month on month, and that base number is growing, there are no other questions asked of this function, right? So this was broadly how I remember us driving these pods. And of course, these evolved. So back then, I think roughly every quarter, we were re-evolving some of these finer points, right? Some of these contracts, some of these pods changed. Some of these pods eventually became separate teams or functions in and of itself.
Got it. So just to then paraphrase, so you had the demand pod. The primary metric was, let's say, to start with qualified leads, then evolved into demos and then to pipeline. And the contract there was, you said the contract there was how many qualified demos were you able to drive, right?
For demand, the contract was experimentation.
Oh, sorry, experimentation. To say how many experiments are you trying and building for the future? To say, okay, fine, we are here right now. Going back to the initial part of the conversation, said if you didn't have a budget constraint, what could you do with it, right? And what experiments would you try? Got it. Product marketing acts as a counter lever to demand, to say as a check on the quality, to say is the input that's coming in of good quality, and then subsequently how do you help them? How do you help both the sales team kind of convert in terms of working with the sales team, and for self-serve signups, how do you actually onboard, retain those customers? And for content, it was engagement and qualified traffic, engagement from qualified traffic. That was a metric that you had.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, understood. Now, at this point, like, were these the sort of metrics that you would be looking at as well? And were you looking at this, like, how are you kind of making this work, like tracking all of these metrics, etc.?
That's right. These were the metrics I was tracking. But again, there's a little bit of a pre-story to this. Okay. So we were tracking a ton of metrics even before, right? When I came in and inherited the team was headed by an amazing, we had a really good manager, one of my best marketers till today. Like I'm glad that eventually he accepted me, was my, if I may say so, my protege, was one of the most brilliant minds I've ever seen, right? And this person was the manager of the team then. And then eventually he went on to head demand, went on to head most of strategic execution under me. Amazing, amazing, amazing person. So already had a good load of data. And in Chargebee, there's this one thing to the founders' credit. The founders got data, right? Like they got the essence and need for data. They appreciated it. I don't see that a lot amongst a lot of founders today. Like, sure, everybody wants to say they're data driven, but the depth and understanding of data, I think at Chargebee we did a brilliant job, right? So data, all sorts of data existed, but for me, data is an ass. Okay, like analytics is an ass, right? And when I say an ass, I mean it'll do what you want it to do. If you want it to carry a load, it'll carry a load. If you want it to like walk around, it'll walk around, right? Good analytics to me is the natural child of strategy and operational rigor, right? Which means you need to have a sound strategy in place, and you need to have the discipline to look at the right, like ask the right questions and surface the right insights at a defined periodicity, right? So we had a huge volume of data before, and this data was what a marketer would care about, right? It would have costs and campaigns and campaign conversions, but it wouldn't have conversions from leads to SQLs, say for example, or SQLs to pipeline. It wouldn't have awareness matrices, or it wouldn't have adoption matrices. So it was a very skewed kind of report which had a lot of data that wasn't very relevant to me per se, and it didn't have a bunch of data that I deemed persistent for my, or pertinent, sorry, to my purposes, right? So one of the first things we did with this new kind of pod structures, we started defining every team had matrices. It came down, basically you boil it down to 5 or 6 core matrices, and then the breakdown of those matrices, right? Like, so that imagine 4 matrices and the contracts along with it, and that's what you're tracking on a periodic basis. And then there are drill downs of it that you can go into as required, right? So that became the first cut of our operational dash. And then it kind of evolved as our purposes grew. It evolved further on from there to, I think recently I published this, my MIS, my dashboard on LinkedIn. It had at scale around 73 different matrices across different functions, across demand, brand, product adoption, engagement, retention, expansion, all of that. And was obviously at any point in time, I wouldn't be tracking all the 70. I mean, I would have all the 73 matrices. I wouldn't be looking into all of those 73 matrices. But across different points in time, say even within a quarter, these would help me have kind of a holistic picture of what's happening in my department and within the org.
Got it. So we'll make it a point to add a link to that MIS for sure, along with the show notes. And I guess what you're saying is there were 73 metrics eventually, but you would know where to look at depending on what was the most pressing problem, and then go deeper at that level, right? Now, when you fast forward from the initial 5-member team to, let's say, 12 months later, right, at a ballpark level, how had the team evolved from a marketing perspective? How had the business evolved at that time for Chargebee?
Okay, so the business doesn't wait for the team, right? So the business is growing, and Chargebee was a juggernaut. It was growing at, we were doubling and trebling in revenue like year on year, right? So, and customers were growing, the base of customers were growing, the scale of problems that we had to solve at the top of the funnel was growing. And really in the initial days, our team, the marketing team, didn't grow quite as fast, right? Which is a good and a bad. It was a bad thing in that I guess we scaled our hiring not as quickly as we should have, and then we had a brief, maybe a 2 quarter period where we had to play catch up. But it was also a good thing because the team that we had ended up really having to, like, all of us had to stretch ourselves to solve for multiple things, and we really had to get very hyper focused on what we wanted to prioritize and what we had to cut out, right? Like there could have been 100 things that we wanted to do, but there were 10 things that we had to do, and therefore had to prioritize on those 10 things. And then of the remaining 90 things that we wanted to do but we couldn't do, we would sit down and say, okay, which of these really excites us enough to push for that 11th thing? And that became the cycle, right?
It's a very tough one, right? Like when I speak to my team as well, I'm like, hey, it's not that what you're saying is not a great idea, right? It's something that we should definitely do. But it's a question of life or death right now. Do you really think that's going to kill us? Otherwise, probably we can do it a while later, right? I mean, when I say kill us in the sense, the same sense of like prioritization, right?
So there were a bunch of tiny things here, right? So tiny in the sense from a, like, it seems silly for me to even talk about it, but I don't know, maybe to some listener somewhere this might be useful. So I created a Slack channel, a public Slack channel called Marketing Brain Farts, right? And the purpose of this channel was very simple. It was brain farts. You have a random silly idea that you think you can focus on, that marketing can focus on, throw it down there. And it started with something that I would throw down my ideas, and the founders would throw in their ideas, and eventually some of my teammates would. And then we had a whole bunch of different people just throwing in ideas there, right? It wasn't like any idea there. Maybe we would give you a thumbs up or a smiley there, but it wasn't like, it would turn into a huge conversation or anything. But I made it a point with my ops team to kind of sift through this channel at least once a week and look at, okay, what are the new things coming up? What are the ideas coming up? So you're constantly sourcing ideas from different parts of the organization. And the fun thing about marketing, and maybe a little bit about product also, is it's not like most ideas are not linear, right? You have an idea that sounds great, but then you try to execute it and it goes bust. And then you have another idea that comes in. And then you have a third idea which you had like 2 years ago but sounded silly. And then these three things merge together to give you something beautifully executable, right? And then you go and it hits the road, and you don't even know where it came from, but it's just useful to have this kind of a place where you can throw down all ideas. And this has gone through multiple, like this. So there's this notion of Spark files where you just jot down ideas in a book somewhere and you keep sifting through it and all of that. And it's happened, like we did it in notes, we did it in a spreadsheet and all. Slack was the easiest because you almost always have Slack open. It's open on your phone. It's such an easy place for you to jot down stuff. And given the, like, if you throw down the freedom that you don't have to question something, you don't have to like critique something there, which is what happens if you start, I love commenting and discussing on something, but there's just a place for you to throw whatever idea there is. It just starts being a beautiful thing.
No, I agree. I mean, I think sourcing from your company, especially your sales team, your customer success team, right? Like, I can already see at Factors that you have like a customer success team, but they're only looking at customer success and what's happening in the customer calls, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to do now is to say, hey, as in when you're speaking to customers, just help me understand what are the specific questions that they have, right? Can I address it more top of the funnel through content, right? Can I build a bridge between the feedback that customer success team is hearing directly from customers and put that out as content, right? And same thing for sales teams, right? Like, what kind of objections, what was a trigger for them to start looking for the solution? It is still quite hard to, even with all the call recording solutions out there, right? The calls are all recorded. It is all there in Gong or some equivalent. But then connecting that back with another team, which is not looking at it, still is kind of a challenge, right? So something that I've been looking at as to how to solve. How did you guys do this, right? Like just getting the more authentic sales input and then leveraging that in marketing. Was it through the Slack channel or some other way?
It was through Slack channels from time to time, but here's the thing, right? So in my opinion, understanding the customer is the biggest super weapon that a product marketer can bring to the table, that any in a product company can, but particularly marketing and particularly product marketing, right? If you understand your customer, if you know your customer's pains and problem statements, it's magic, right? And this again we evolved through, like early on, most of us were kind of clued in on the customer to a certain degree, right? We were at least, we would listen in on customer calls, or we would somehow have passive conversations about what was happening in the customer world, and that was okay. But as we started getting slightly bigger and we had to structure this, and especially once we started getting departmentalized, right, where you don't have this degree of cross-pollination anymore. I think in 2018, we started doing this thing where we had, like, I guess most startups are familiar with the value prop canvas. So the value prop canvas, in case you're not, it's publicly available. You can just Google it. This beautiful framework to place your customers' problems alongside your product's capability. So you have, imagine on one side, you have your customer, the jobs that your customer is hiring your product. So, right, the jobs that your customer has to do, basically, the pains that they face in doing these jobs and their aspirations. And then on the other side, you have your product's capabilities, the pain relievers in your products, and the gain creators in your product, right? And you want to create a mapping between these two. And so in 2018, we started this thing where we basically got the entire team together to start actively whiteboarding our value prop canvas every quarter. And in doing this, two things happen. One is, of course, you get the entire team to build a common context of the customer pains and all of that. But the second thing, you also know to what an extent you don't understand your customer, right? And it creates a force function for you to like go and, oh my God, I don't actually know the jobs that my customer is trying to do, or the actual pains that my customer faces when they're doing this job. And that creates a forcing function for you to go learn, right? So we did that.
Vikram, and just to kind of make this real for listeners, right? Can you think of an example where something that you've learned from a conversation that surprised you to say, hey, I didn't know this.
Okay, yeah, and again, right, in hindsight, a lot of things seem very silly, but I'm trying to go back in time to that time where that, there was this collective light bulb. So for us at Chargebee, trying to explain what a subscription management software does, or why do you need a subscription management software, it's kind of not super intuitive, right? For the people who get it, yeah, it's obvious. For the people who don't, who are like, oh, I can build this myself. Why do I need it? Where does it plug in? Blah, blah, blah. So many questions. And we had this problem of where do we even start, right? And so we did and so we started talking to customers, right? The most natural thing, we started doing a series of customer interviews. And even before we got onto the first call, this really funky thing happened where somebody in our product design team was explaining some Salesforce connectors, right? And they were trying to explain how our customers' sales processes work, right? How their customers went through different stages before they got onto a revenue cycle in, say, Salesforce. And they were showing this. They were trying to explain all the thousands of permutation combinations in these use cases and all. And I was standing in the back of the room, and it all looked the same. Like there were specific differences in the boxes, but all of these boxes look the same, right? And so this little spark that, okay, you know what? There is a workflow of how my customers look at their revenue cycle. And if I'm able to understand their workflow, I can exactly plug in where Chargebee fits into them, what a subscription management software can do for them, where they can drive, say, pricing experiments, yada, yada. That kind of spark went off from just this. So we got into a series of customer calls. And the promise of these customer calls was, you talk to us about your revenue cycle, and I will build a revenue cycle guide for you. Right? We'll sit down, we'll build out a guide for you, and we'll kind of consult with you on where you can tweak and experiment and scale your subscription revenue. right? And that proved magical for us. One, because we ended up getting like some 60, 70 direct conversations with customers. The entire marketing team had like some folks in the team, this was the first time they ever had a direct conversation with a customer, right? So that was brilliant. But we realized that across all of these, everybody's revenue cycle fell into about 8 different workflows. So you imagine as a product marketer how much that simplifies your narrative and storytelling. Like, what are you trying to take to the world? Well, you fall into one of these 8 workflows. If you can figure out which workflow you are in, this is exactly how I'm going to add value to you at that point, right?
Got it. Understood. So that works out into sales discovery and the sales demo conversations to say, so the first point becomes figuring out which workflow does a customer fall under so that you can talk about Chargebee's value accordingly.
Exactly. Right. And now this was like, now we could create like our sales enablement was now like a simple click, ask these 3 questions. This is exactly the value prop that we want to pitch, right? It became that cohesive, right? That understandable. And from there, like customer discovery alone was like, I think that deserves a podcast in and of itself, right? That's something that's again a field that I enjoy a lot. There's tiny nuances from each of these experiments that's brilliant, right? So I think by 2019, no, maybe 2020, we created, like, we had this pretty formal structure where every week we would do a customer teardown, right? And this started, I think, between marketing and product. I don't remember where it started, but pretty soon it became an org-wide thing where, you know, the entire organization would kind of get clued in, and we'd be talking about a particular customer's journey. We'd have sales presenting what happened, marketing presenting what happened at the top of the funnel, product presenting what they, like, you know, how they are deriving value from that particular capability. And now you get a complete story of a particular type of customer, right? So that was a brilliant thing that happened. And then by 20, maybe late 2019, early 2020, this other, not going to call it a metric, this other, okay, let's call it a, it's not really a metric, this other thing, okay, let's call it thing, okay, became that I know I'm absolutely in love with. I can't stop talking about it. It's called the ZMOT, or the zero moment of truth. There's not as much information about it out in the wild, but there are a couple of books on the topic. There was this concept started, I think, by Google. I'm not sure, but it basically means the zero moment of truth, right? And imagine the first moment of truth is when a customer ends up in some way interfacing with you, comes to your website or signs up for your product or, you know, requests a demo. What happened in this customer's life leading up to this moment? It's back that story, either by actively asking the customer, or in most cases, you are going to have to, you know, go down into first principles and figure it out. And that guides an amazing thing on, okay, what's your purpose for being? What is that exact moment where a customer was happy without your product? They were happy, they were okay, they didn't even they realized that they needed your product, and then something happened, right? One weekend, the analyst had an angry bunch of emails from the CEO asking them to pull out a dashboard, and they were like, okay, where do I go about doing this? I don't know. Pulled out some report, burnt their Saturday midnight oil, sent it to the CEO. The CEO comes back and says, well, I need to drill down into this. Tell me why this phenomenon is happening. And then they're like, oh my God, there must be a better way. And they come in and they realize that there are beautiful drill downable and self-serve business intelligence systems like ThoughtSpot, right? And that's the zero moment of truth story.
Got it. So for a Chargebee, it could be something like, there is a thought to say, let's try and experiment with this new pricing model, and that comes down from, let's say, a CEO, and then you realize that you're not set up to kind of do that, and that internal trigger is what causes a search for a solution like Chargebee. If I'm reading this correctly.
Yes, correct. That's correct, right? And I'll give you a specific example in Chargebee's, an actual example in Chargebee's case, without telling you the customer. So there was one customer who had been manually invoicing their, this was a startup. They'd been manually sending out invoices, right? Like sales sells the PO. shares that to an analyst in finance. Finance sends out an invoice, and that's how business was done, right? People clicked a link in invoice, maybe made a payment, and that's how life was happening. And they were growing. They had like 10 invoices, 15 invoices, 2,500. And one day, this analyst receives about 450 customer invoices that he has to send out manually. 450, right? And it was like insane, right? Like, no, obviously this person's not going to be able to process all these 450. They have to batch it. Some invoices get forgotten. You realize that for the past 3 months, a bunch of customers have not even been invoiced, which means you haven't been able to collect their payments either, right? And that's the zero moment of truth. They're like, oh my God, there must be an automated way to do this madness. And they come in and sign
Got
up
it.
for Chargebee.
Understood. Got it. Vikram, so so you were saying in terms of funneling customer feedback into marketing or ensuring that the team is plugged in. So you said you gave like a few sort of ways you got that done. Right? So first was a Slack channel, and you had everyone in the company kind of contributing ideas over there. The second one you said was like weekly sort of meetings with the team where you were kind of getting a more complete picture from sales, marketing, and product in terms of like what was happening. The third was customer teardowns in terms of take one customer, break down their full journey, what happened, what caused them to start looking for a solution, and then that gives you anecdotal evidence to to further improve your marketing, right? And the zero moment of truth that you spoke about, how did you operationalize it? Like, how did you go about? I mean, it's a great idea, but how do you get to know that systematically?
It's actually it's reasonably hard because it's qualitative and it's very simple. I know that sounds like a paradox, but sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to actually execute, right? So zero moment of truth is basically just going down and asking why, right? The 5 whys method or the means and change analysis. But you're basically going down and saying, okay, why did this happen? Why did this customer come in, right? And so for us, operationalizing it came down to the first call that the customer has with you. That's when the pain is freshest in their head, right? And especially if you have some kind of a sales, like if you have a pure PLG self-serve flow, it's a little harder unless you're like asking those questions as friction points. But in most cases where you have a sales assist or an inside sales function and your first qualification call, right? So we started asking the customers questions on, okay, so what happened? Tell me a little bit more about what happened. Why did you sign up for this product, right? And that gives you a wealth of information. In most cases, by the time they even come down to the first AE call, the value prop call, that pain point gets forgotten a little bit. Right? They start going down to they start thinking in bullet points. They start telling you, okay, so this is what I want. I want a feature A, B, C in your product. But that initial so we had an SDR function that did qualifications for us. And so for me, the greatest wealth of information came from those SDR qualification calls, not from my AE calls. There was also see, some of these things are maybe a smarter person could have hypothesized some of these things naturally. I'm not that smart. So for me, I had to do certain things. Like I had to be thrown in the deep end to do certain things. And I'm really I thank my lucky stars for that, right? In 2019, we had our first sales kickoff in Chargebee, which was about 5 days where our entire sales team had to go out and do a bunch of workshops and all of that stuff. And of course, our sales team could have spared some time to make sure that they were consuming the lead flow coming in at that point. But we wanted, because marketing was sourcing all of the leads at that point because we were inbound. And we wanted to actually grab on an opportunity if we had it. So we said we'll take the entire initial qualification load at that point. So for those 5 days, marketing was doing the SDR qualification. And you'll typically see this in an inbound org, right? Marketing will say, well, we're giving you all the leads in the world. And sales will say, well, lead quality sucks. And marketing will say, what do you mean? Sucks? You're not calling enough. Those 5 days gave me and my team a chance to actually go in and say, okay, what does quality really mean? Right? And you won't believe this. In 5 days, we figured out means to, okay, you know what? Somebody signed up for the product. what's the best way that we can actually retarget them, say on Facebook or any other social channel in an automated at scale manner to grab them into our initial conversation, right? Because once somebody comes in and signs up or schedules a call with you, you want to make sure that you capitalize on that intent, say within the next 12 to 24 hours, right? So a lot of this learning on, okay, you know what, this is what the pain is that the customer is coming with, actually came from that. So for any GTM leader, especially for marketing leaders, I would greatly advise that spend a couple of days just doing qualification calls, right? Get
Got
the
it.
entire team to spend a couple of days to do SDR work, and you'll be able to unearth patterns and questions that you probably never conceived of before, or you did if you are smarter. But hey, you know what? This is what
Got
I
it.
did.
Vikram, so I just had one more question before we end. So that was around, as you scaled in Chargebee, right? How did the role of analytics metrics kind of change, right? So like, let's say if, once you hit close to like 50 million, 60 million in revenue, was it playing the same role that it did when you were at 3 million, or was it like very different? If so, what was different at that stage?
So the role it played, okay, I'll kind of try and unpack that question a little bit. Okay, so the role it played was pretty, like it's just the same role at a different scale, right? Like analytics, you're trying to get intelligent answers to make decisions. But in 2018, so our first cut analysis analytics was a bunch of matrices, right? It was a bunch of numbers, their conversion ratios, right? And we had like, now most marketing leaders would be used to things like this. We had like very standard problems of static and dynamic information. So for example, right, I have, say, my leads coming in getting converted into sales opportunities, let's say. And if I'm looking at, and so, oh yeah, before this comes down the operational cadences. So I initially said good analytics is the child of strategy and operational rigor. So operational rigor comes down to what are you looking at and how often are you looking at it and what are the questions you're asking of it. So we had, at a function level, every function was responsible for their metrics on a daily basis. In the initial days, we had like, when we were just obsessed on leads, we had a big TV screen in our marketing bay just presenting the lead numbers, updating like almost every 5 minutes or something, right? And that was the core thing, right? Every month the ticker would go down to zero, and we had a target and how well we were hitting on it. And then, right, so but the first cut, a whole bunch of matrices. We were looking at static and dynamic, right? So lead, how well are the leads converting to oh sorry, I was talking about the cadences, right? So where this at a function level, we were looking at matrices almost on a daily basis, doing minor tweaks on it. And initially, I was looking at the overall trends on a weekly basis. For example, sales marketing handoffs would happen on a weekly basis, right? What are my conversion trends looking like? We would have operational reviews every month to review, okay, are we doing the things right? And then we'd have strategic reviews every quarter where we'd be like, okay, the strategy that we decided to execute on this quarter, is that moving us in the right direction or should we reconvene, right? So that's kind of why almost every quarter team dynamics change, like team structures and systems change a little bit. But this was, so we had a daily, a weekly, a monthly, and a quarterly, right? And also the metrics that we look at would change. On a weekly, we were looking, obviously because sales and marketing were doing their thing weekly, we were looking at MQL to, let's say, opportunity conversion. And it turned out to be a tricky problem because it takes time for sales to actually touch all of the leads that you bring in, and you're like, okay, so every week initially we'd be like, okay, this number should be like, it was 35% last week but only 20% this week, but if we came back to it next week, maybe it'll come back to 40, right?
Got
And
it.
so these things became a tricky problem, and we used to call them static and dynamic data, right? So static data is leads created this month, or let's say pipeline. Static data would be how much pipeline was created in the month of May. Dynamic data would be how much pipeline was created of the leads created in May, right? So when we came back to June, that would change. So this was V1. It was useful. It was also very tricky to play around with. From where we evolved to V2, where we had a more intelligent cohortized view. So we started analyzing everything in cohorts. We looked at, okay, so now when we spoke to sales, we could talk about things like week 0 conversions. So if I got a lead this week, what's the conversion rate that I expect in the same week? I got 100 leads this week. Last week of the leads I got last week, I was able to convert 20% in the same week. This week I was only able to convert 15%. What's happening, right? So it became a little bit more intelligent, right? Then we started dashboarding these trends and becoming a slightly even smarter about it. At scale, lots of data. We were still doing our quarterly business reviews and looking at strategic questions and all of that. But still, every week, every Monday, we initially would have about a 3-hour conversation between me and my operations team, my head of ops, and we would bring in other function leaders as required, where we'd go into what broke, what was an anomaly last week, why was that an anomaly, and then we would try to diagnose the problem and come back to a solution. And we started logging these things. Every time there was an anomaly, we would log that anomaly. Initially, it would be like, oh, okay, like at the end of 3 hours, it would be something like, oh, okay, we don't know what it is, but Duman would have to go in a little deeper, tweak an experiment, and come back with a result. But we started just logging these, and then logging, did we finish this diagnostics? What happened about it? What are we doing about it? In about 6 months, we now had a repository of possible issues, right? Leads are good, but pipeline is down. Was there a sales process change, right? So like pretty foundational stuff, but we started being able to ask questions of this sort, right? And I'm just trying to pull up a really cool.
So just by logging this, you were able to reference it back in future to say, hey, when this sort of a thing happens, these are the 3 possible candidates. So it kind of helps you react faster and get to the root cause faster.
Correct.
You were about to pull up something, sorry.
Yeah, and finally we built out this pathway that in hindsight we call applesauce. We didn't call it applesauce when we did it. In hindsight, we call it applesauce. But we basically built this pathway of, if there is a problem, how are you going to go in and diagnose it, right? And applesauce, A stands for accuracy. So you start first looking at, there is a problem. Is the data accurate, or is there a plumbing problem, right? 9 out of 10 times there's a plumbing problem, right? You looked at the data wrong. Was there a process change, right? You had a bunch of SDRs shift from night shift to morning or something of that sort, and maybe there was a drop because of that, right? Is there a plumbing issue? Did your CRM connector break? Did some other thing, like, so basically the first 3 things: accuracy, process, plumbing issue, basically tell you is there a problem in the first place, or are you looking at a red flag and worrying unnecessarily? Then you look at, is it a local issue or a global issue, right? So this is a very useful thing, especially if you are a global player and you see there's a drop in pipeline, right? A very common thing would be there's a 30% drop in pipeline in North America and everything else looks okay, right? There's only a 10% drop in Europe and only a 3% drop in APAC, right? But turns out, let's say 80% of your demand is in North America, and therefore the sensitivity of a drop in North America is perceived a lot more than sensitivity in other places, right? So trying to diagnose is this really a local issue or a global issue? Then the E is for, is it an episodic issue or is it a prolonged problem, right? It was Memorial Day weekend, and therefore it was a 4-day week, and therefore traffic was lower. So localized, it's an episodic thing. It happens once in a while. The S is a seasonality effect. So the first time we were driving our demand at scale, and I think around around May, June, we started seeing an abysmal drop in Europe, and we were like scratching our heads, trying to figure out what happens. And then we realized that most of Europe pretty much shuts down over summer, right? Like people aren't coming down to buy, right? So understanding seasonality of your markets is a pretty useful diagnostic tip. And then comes down to the behavior of this delta that's happening, right? Is it accelerating or is it steady, right? There's a drop, but is this drop nosediving or is it drop and then flat? Is it a universal problem or is it an internal problem? By which, like, go talk to another buddy of yours in a different organization in the same kind of space, or talk to the same markets, or just go out there and get on Twitter or just Google maybe to figure out if this is a problem that's happening across, right?
Got it.
Uh,
Not specific to your company, but across the board.
One other interesting way, especially if you have a good SEM play, is if your competitors are getting very aggressive on brand keywords, that means there is probably something like they're also seeing a drop in their overall inbound traffic. Right? Then the C is for channels, channel, campaign, and source. Go in and diagnose which channel is breaking or which campaign is breaking or which source is breaking. And then the last is E for errata, which is any random event other than this group, right? But in most cases, you won't come down to E. By the time you come down to E, you would have zeroed in on, oh, this is where the problem is, right? So became a very useful framework for us to go into how do we get down into this diagnostic part. You could do it like we did for a very long time without this kind of a framework, but just naturally started going down to, okay, if there is a problem, first thing, is it a mechanical problem or is it an electrical problem? If it's an electrical problem, is it like, you don't want to just start unplugging all your ICs and chips if it's just a screw that you have to change.
Yeah, and it's more efficient also, right? Like you're not doing this every month, every week for 3 hours and then realizing, oh, it's the same seasonality issue again, right? So, and I mean, same story, right? Like we go through like the same weekly cycle. Oh, why did this happen? This went down. The same, like almost exactly the same issues of dynamic versus like yeah, we've got so many SQLs this month, but let's wait for one more month. This number will go up, right? So I think a lot of takeaways over there, and as I said, probably something that we need to unpack in more detail over multiple episodes rather than cover it in one shot. Anyways, Vikram, this was super useful. Thanks a lot for your time. I think there is a lot that folks could take away, especially as they are scaling from that 4 million to 18 million across, setting up teams, getting that customer feedback into marketing, as well as from an analytics and data-driven diagnostics perspective, right? So thanks a lot for sharing this, Vikram. And any sort of material that you have, please send it over to me. I'll add it into the show notes so that it is available at one place for folks to kind of consume.
For sure, I'll do that. And thank you so much for having me, Praveen. This was awesome. Always fun to talk to you guys at Factors. So this was great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Vikram. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to meeting you again at the next episode. All right.